I want them gone. All of them, Victor Blackwell shouted, slamming his fist against the hospital wall. The nurse stepped back in shock. Sir, they're your children, she whispered. Triplets. Victor's face contorted with rage. This wasn't the deal. I paid for one child. One. That woman tricked me. He stormed toward Elise's room, his expensive suit contrasting sharply with the clinical surroundings. I'll make her pay for this deception. What would you do if you were Elise? Has Victor gone too far, or does he have a right to be angry? Comment below with your thoughts. If you want to discover how this shocking situation unfolds, and whether these innocent babies will find love, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. The next part reveals a twist that will leave you speechless. Victor Blackwell, 57, couldn't shake the trembling in his hands as he paced the sterile hospital corridor. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his distinguished features, salt and pepper hair meticulously styled, crow's feet around steel-gray eyes that had stared down corporate rivals without flinching. But this was different. Mr. Blackwell, Dr. Reynolds approached cautiously, clipboard in hand. I understand this is unexpected, but perhaps you'd like to see them? The triplets are doing remarkably well, considering. Victor stopped pacing and leveled a cold stare at the doctor. Considering what? That their mother lied to me? That this entire arrangement has been corrupted? The doctor shifted uncomfortably. Sir, Miss Laurent didn't deceive you. Multiple births are always a possibility with fertility treatments. It was in the paperwork you both signed. The fine print, Victor scoffed, running a hand through his hair. Always the fine print. He turned to look out the window at the Manhattan skyline. The city that had shaped him, hardened him, rewarded him with wealth beyond measure, but left him wanting in ways money couldn't fix. 60 floors below, people moved like ants, living their ordinary lives, forming connections he'd long ago written off as unnecessary complications. I wanted an heir, Doctor. One child to carry on my name, my legacy. Not a ready-made family. Dr. Reynolds nodded sympathetically. Many things in life don't go according to plan, Mr. Blackwell. Sometimes those deviations become our greatest blessings. Victor waved away the platitude. Save the Hallmark card wisdom. Where is Marcus? He should have been here an hour ago. As if summoned by his impatience, the elevator doors opened, and Marcus Bennett strode purposefully down the corridor. At 62, his longtime attorney moved with the confidence of a man who had navigated the murky waters of high-stakes legal battles for decades. His charcoal suit was impeccable, his red tie a splash of controlled aggression. Victor, Marcus greeted him, briefcase in hand. I came as soon as I could. Traffic on the FDR was brutal. Some demonstration about pension cuts, Victor grunted. And my contract? Tell me there's a clause, something I can invoke. Marcus's expression tightened. Let's discuss this somewhere private. They found an empty consultation room, and Marcus closed the door behind them. The vinyl chairs squeaked as they sat down, the sound jarring in the tense silence. I've reviewed everything, Marcus began, his voice measured. The contract is binding, Victor. In fact, it's ironclad in Ms. Laurent's favor. What are you talking about? Victor's voice was dangerously quiet. The agreement stipulates that you would financially support any children resulting from the procedure. Not child, children. The plurality was explicit. Victor's jaw clenched. You drafted that contract. How could you miss something so fundamental? I didn't miss anything, Marcus replied calmly. You were presented with every detail. The possibility of multiple births was outlined on page 4, paragraph 3. You initialed it yourself. Victor stared at his oldest friend, the betrayal stinging. He remembered that day in his office, the stack of papers, his impatience to get the formalities over with. He trusted Marcus to handle the details while he focused on the big picture, securing his legacy through a child of his own blood. So what are you saying? Victor finally asked. I'm saying you have 3 heirs now instead of 1. Congratulations. Marcus's tone softened. Look, I know this isn't what you planned, but don't. Victor cut him off. Don't give me some speech about silver linings. This changes everything, does it? Marcus challenged. You wanted someone to carry on your name. Now you have 3 someones. Victor stood abruptly and walked to the window. Below, the hospital parking lot was filling with visitors. Families coming together, sharing joy and sorrow. Something he'd convinced himself he neither needed nor wanted. She can't handle 3 newborns, he said quietly. Not alone, not with her background. So you're concerned about her now? Marcus raised an eyebrow. Victor turned, his expression hardening. I'm concerned about my children. They deserve better than a formerly homeless woman with no support system. Then provide that support, Marcus suggested. It doesn't have to be all or nothing, Victor. Victor, life rarely is, despite how you've always approached it. A knock at the door interrupted them. Martha, Victor's housekeeper of 15 years, entered with her characteristic quiet efficiency. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her practical shoes squeaking slightly on the linoleum floor. Mr. Blackwell, she said, her voice carrying the gentle lilt of her Jamaican heritage. I brought the items you requested. Victor nodded. Thank you, Martha. Any issues at the house? None, sir. Though Rosalind called to confirm your dinner meeting with the Japanese investors tomorrow. I told her you might need to reschedule. Victor's expression darkened. No. Everything proceeds as planned. My personal situation doesn't affect business. Martha's eyes, wise from 6 decades of life experience, met his briefly before she nodded. As you wish, sir. Will there be anything else? No? You can wait in the car. After Martha left, Marcus sighed heavily. You know, Victor, some men would see 3 children as a blessing, not a complication to be managed. Some men didn't watch their father lose everything trying to support a family he couldn't afford, Victor retorted. Some men didn't spend their childhood listening to their mother cry herself to sleep because another bill collector called. The memories surfaced uninvited. The tiny apartment in Queens, the constant worry about money, his father's defeated expression when he lost his job at the factory, the promises Victor had made to himself, never to be vulnerable, never to depend on anyone, never to let emotions cloud his judgment. That was 50 years ago, Marcus said gently. You're not your father, and these children won't face the hardships you did. Victor's phone buzzed. A text from Rosalind. Beijing office needs decision on merger. Deadline midnight. I need to make some calls, Victor said, already mentally shifting to the familiar territory of business decisions. Victor? Marcus's voice stopped him. At least see them before you decide anything. You owe yourself that much. The suggestion hung in the air between them, a challenge Victor wasn't sure he wanted to accept. Seeing them would make this real in a way he wasn't prepared for. Fine, he conceded finally, but then we discuss options. They made their way to the nursery, where 3 clear bassinets held tiny bundles wrapped in hospital blankets. The nurse brightened when she saw them. Mr. Blackwell, would you like to meet your children? Victor approached cautiously, as though the infants might somehow sense his ambivalence and react to it. The first bassinet held a baby with a shock of dark hair and a serious expression. The identification card read, Baby boy Blackwell A. He has your eyebrows, the nurse commented cheerfully, very determined looking. The second bassinet contained another boy, slightly smaller than his brother, his tiny fists clenched as if ready to fight the world. The third baby, a girl, was awake, her unfocused eyes seeming to look right at Victor. Something in her gaze, innocent yet somehow knowing, caught him off guard. She wasn't crying or fussing like he would have expected. She was simply present, watching, waiting. Would you like to hold your daughter? The nurse asked. I don't think. Victor stumbled over his words, a rare occurrence for a man known for his articulate confidence. It's quite simple, she assured him, already lifting the tiny bundle. Just support her head like this. Before he could protest, Victor found himself cradling a newborn that weighed less than his briefcase. She was warm and delicate, utterly dependent on the adults around her. A strange sensation spread through his chest. Discomfort, certainly, but something else too. Something he didn't have a name for. She has her mother's eyes, Marcus observed from beside him. Same shade of blue. Victor hadn't intended to think about Elise, the woman who had carried these children. He'd kept their interactions formal, detached. She was providing a service, nothing more. Yet in those moments in his car months ago, when she challenged him with her directness, he'd glimpsed something in her that resonated with him. A resilience forged through hardship. "How is she?" he found himself asking the nurse. "Miss Laurent?" "Exhausted but stable," the nurse replied. "Delivering triplets is no small feat, especially for someone with her. Health history." The subtle judgment in her tone wasn't lost on Victor. He knew what people thought when they learned of their arrangement. Gold digger, they'd assume of her. Exploitative, they'd think of him. Neither understood the pragmatism that had brought them to this point. The baby in his arms made a small sound. Not quite a cry, but a statement of presence. Victor looked down at her, this tiny person who shared his DNA, who would grow up in a world so different from the one he'd known as a child. "What will you name them?" the nurse asked. The question caught him off guard. Names? Of course they needed names. In his meticulous planning, he'd considered trust funds and educational paths, but not something as fundamental as what these children would be called. "I haven't decided," he said stiffly. "Well, there's time," the nurse assured him. Many parents wait to see what fits their little ones. Parents. The word echoed uncomfortably. He wasn't a parent. He was a progenitor, a genetic contributor. Parenthood implied involvement, nurturing, emotional investment. All things he'd specifically structured this arrangement to avoid. The baby girl in his arms yawned, her tiny mouth forming a perfect O. For a brief moment, Victor felt an irrational urge to protect her from everything. From the harshness of the world he'd navigated so successfully. From the emptiness of pursuing wealth for its own sake. From the loneliness he would never admit plagued him in the quiet hours of the night. He handed her back to the nurse. The moment of connection broken. "I need to speak with Miss Laurent," he said firmly. "She's resting," the nurse cautioned. "It's important." Victor made his way to Elise's room, each step heavier than the last. He wasn't sure what he would say to her, only that something needed to be said. The arrangement they'd made now seemed absurdly simplistic, in the face of 3 actual humans who needed more than financial provisions. He knocked once and entered without waiting for a response. Elise Laurent lay against the white hospital pillows, her golden hair spread around her like a halo. Despite having just given birth to triplets, there was a quiet dignity about her. Her eyes, the color of a summer sky, opened at his entrance. "Victor," she acknowledged him, her French accent more pronounced in her exhaustion. "Elise," he remained standing just inside the doorway. "I've seen them." A small smile touched her lips. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" "They're unexpected," he replied carefully. "Life often is." She adjusted herself slightly, wincing with the movement. "You're angry. It wasn't a question." "I'm recalibrating," he said after a moment. "This isn't what we agreed to." Elise's expression hardened slightly. "I didn't plan for triplets, Victor. But here they are. 3 little lives that we created, however clinically. What would you have me do? Select one and discard the others?" The bluntness of her question stunned him momentarily. "Of course not," he said sharply. "I'm not a monster." "Then what? What do you want from me now?" Victor moved further into the room, taking the chair beside her bed. He noticed the absence of flowers, cards, balloons, all the traditional trappings of celebration. There was no one in her life to acknowledge this momentous event, just as there was no one in his by choice rather than circumstance. The contract stipulated you would be compensated for 1 child, and then you would return to France, he said. "This complicates things." Elise studied him, her gaze unwavering. "Everything is always business with you, isn't it?" "Even when it comes to your own flesh and blood. Business is predictable, clear. Emotions cloud judgment, and yet here you are, emotional despite yourself." Her observation struck uncomfortably close to the truth. "I've seen it in your eyes when you look at them. You feel something, Victor, whether you want to or not. He stood abruptly uncomfortable with her perception. The point is, the original arrangement needs to be revised. Into what? She challenged. Will you pay me triple to walk away from 3 babies instead of 1? Will that ease your conscience? This isn't about my conscience, he snapped. Isn't it? Elisa's voice was soft but penetrating. You orchestrated this entire situation to satisfy your need for a legacy without the messiness of human connection. But children are the very definition of messy human connection, Victor. They don't fit into neat contractual boxes. Her words hit with the force of truth. Victor turned to look out the window, gathering his thoughts. The New York skyline stretched before him, a testament to human ambition and ingenuity. He'd conquered it financially, becoming a titan in a city of strivers. Yet standing in this simple hospital room, faced with the unexpected complications of his own making, he felt oddly out of his depth. "What do you want, Elise?" he finally asked, turning back to her. "Besides the money." She looked surprised by the question. "What I've always wanted. A home. Security. Purpose." She hesitated, then added softly, not to be alone anymore. The simplicity of her answer resonated with him, though he'd never have admitted it. Wasn't that what he wanted too? Not just an heir, but connection? Someone to whom his accomplishments mattered not for their monetary value, but for the person behind them. Triple the original amount, he said suddenly. Plus a house in Connecticut, good schools nearby. A full-time nanny. Elisa's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying 3 children need more support than 1. I'm saying you shouldn't have to do this alone. And you, will you be part of their lives?" Victor hesitated. The question forced him to confront what he really wanted, not just for his legacy but for himself. "I'll visit regularly." The commitment felt foreign on his tongue. They should know who their father is. A cautious hope lit Elisa's features, and the contract clause requiring me to leave revised. "You stay. They need their mother." He paused, then added, "And perhaps I need to learn what it means to be a father." It wasn't a declaration of love or even affection. It was a pragmatic acknowledgement of a new reality. But for a man who had spent decades walling himself off from meaningful connection, it represented a seismic shift. Elise reached out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Victor took it. Her fingers were warm against his, a simple human contact that somehow felt more significant than the countless handshakes that had sealed his billion-dollar deals. "Life has a way of giving us what we need, Victor. Not always what we think we want," she said softly. As he sat there, holding the hand of a woman who had been a stranger just months ago, Victor Blackwell, titan of industry, master of his domain, felt the foundations of his carefully constructed world begin to shift, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't immediately try to shore up the walls. Outside, the Manhattan sky began to darken, the city's lights coming alive one by one. Inside room 507 of New York Presbyterian Hospital, something else was awakening. The possibility that the greatest legacy a person could leave might not be measured in buildings or bank accounts, but in the courage to let another human being matter. The next few days at the hospital passed in a blur of nurses, doctors, and paperwork. Victor found himself spending more time there than he'd anticipated, drawn back each day to check on the triplets' progress. The smallest of the 3, his daughter, was having some respiratory issues, though Dr. Reynolds assured him it was common with multiples, and nothing to be overly concerned about. "She's a fighter," the doctor said, watching Victor peer through the NICU window. "Just like her father, I'd imagine." Victor didn't respond. Fighter. Yes, he'd been called that before. Usually in boardrooms right before he took everything his opponents had. But this tiny being's fight was different. More pure, more essential. He'd arranged for Elise to have the hospital's VIP suite, though he suspected the gesture was more for his own peace of mind than for her comfort. When he visited her room that afternoon, he found her sitting up in bed, a notepad in her lap. "Making plans already?" he asked, his tone more gentle than he'd intended. Elise looked up, surprised by his presence, just jotting down names. "They need names, Victor." He nodded, taking the chair beside her bed. I suppose they do. I thought perhaps you'd want to choose, she said carefully. Given the circumstances, Victor considered this, names. Such a simple thing, and yet it felt momentous. Do you have any suggestions? A small smile touched her lips. For the boys, I was thinking Thomas and James. For the girl, Sophia. My grandfather was named James, Victor said, the memory surprising him. He hadn't thought of the old man in years. He taught me to fish when I was a boy. Had a little cabin on Lake George. Then James it is for one of them, Elise said softly. Victor nodded, uncharacteristically lost in memory. Thomas is fine too. But for the girl, he hesitated. What about Grace? It was my mother's name. Something warm flickered in Elise's eyes. Grace Sophia, perhaps. She'll need all the grace she can get, being outnumbered by her brothers. It was Victor's turn to smile, just slightly. Grace Sophia Blackwell. Yes, that sounds right. The moment was broken by a knock at the door. Marcus entered, his expression grave. Victor, we need to talk, privately. Victor excused himself and followed Marcus into the hallway. What is it? We have a problem. Marcus pulled out his tablet and showed Victor the screen. On it was a gossip site with the headline, Blackwell baby bombshell. Billionaire pays homeless woman for heirs. Victor's blood ran cold. How the hell did they find out? Unclear. But it's spreading fast. Marcus scrolled through more headlines. The market is reacting. Blackwell Industries stock dropped 3 points this morning. Victor clenched his jaw. This is exactly why I wanted discretion. The vultures will turn this into a circus. It gets worse, Marcus said grimly. Someone leaked parts of the contract to the press. They're painting you as exploitative, using your wealth to buy children from a vulnerable woman. That's not what happened, Victor snapped. Isn't it? Marcus challenged quietly. Victor glared at his oldest friend. Whose side are you on, Marcus? Yours, always. But we need to get ahead of this. The board is calling for an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Victor ran a hand through his hair. Fine, set it up. And find out who leaked this. I want them buried. When Marcus left, Victor stood alone in the hallway, the weight of public scrutiny pressing down on him. His phone buzzed. Rosalind again. More fires to put out. More decisions that couldn't wait. The world of business never stopped, even when your personal life was imploding. He returned to Elise's room. His expression shuttered once more. Is everything all right? She asked. No, he said flatly. The story has leaked to the press. We're about to become front-page news. Elise paled. I didn't tell anyone. I know. Victor sighed. But now we need to decide how to handle this. Together. The word hung between them. Together. The word hung between them. A concept so foreign to Victor that it felt like speaking a language he barely remembered. What will you tell them? She asked. Victor considered this. The truth. A simplified version anyway. That we entered a legal arrangement for surrogacy. And the triplets? Are my children, Victor said firmly. That's all anyone needs to know. Elise studied him, her blue eyes probing. And what about me? What am I in this story, Victor? It was a question he hadn't fully considered until that moment. What was she? Not just a surrogate anymore. Not a wife or partner, but not nothing either. You're their mother, he said finally. Beyond that, we'll figure it out. Is Victor making the right choice? Should Elise trust him with her future and their children's lives? Drop your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to like this video. The final part reveals a twist no one sees coming. The board meeting the next morning was exactly the bloodbath Victor had expected. 8 men and 3 women, all over 60, all looking at him with varying degrees of judgment and concern. This is a PR nightmare, Victor, said Harold Winters, the longest-serving board member. His jowls quivered with indignation. The media is painting you as some sort of modern-day Henry VIII, buying babies instead of beheading wives. That's ridiculous, Victor replied coolly. This was a private arrangement between consenting adults. Nothing illegal occurred. It's not about legality. Diane Mercer cut in. She'd been a friend of Victor's mother once, before cancer took her. Now, at 72, she was the moral compass of the board. It's about perception. You've built Blackwell Industries on an image of integrity and traditional values. This arrangement, it feels cold. Calculate. Business is cold and calculated, Victor countered. I've never pretended otherwise. But family isn't business, Diane replied softly. At least it shouldn't be. Victor felt the weight of their collective disapproval. These people had known him for decades, had watched him build his empire brick by brick. Some had even known him as a young man, when idealism hadn't yet hardened into pragmatism. So what would you have me do? He asked. Harold adjusted his glasses. Distance yourself. Issue a statement through legal that this was a standard surrogacy agreement. Move the woman to another state. Pay her well, of course, and hire nannies for the children. Keep them out of the spotlight until this blows over. Victor felt something rise in his chest. Anger, but not the cold, controlled anger he was accustomed to. This was hotter, more primal. Those are my children, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. I will not ship them off like unwanted packages. A stunned silence fell over the boardroom. In 30 years, none of them had heard Victor Blackwell prioritize anything over business interests. Victor, Marcus said carefully, perhaps we should consider all options before. No. Victor stood. This meeting is over. I'll handle the PR situation my way. As he strode from the room, he could feel their stares burning into his back. For the first time in his career, Victor Blackwell had directly defied his board. And stranger still, he didn't regret it. When he returned to the hospital that afternoon, he found Martha waiting outside Elise's room, her practical handbag clutched tightly in her lap. Mr. Blackwell, she greeted him, rising. I hope you don't mind. I thought Ms. Laurent might appreciate some company while you were at your meeting. Victor was surprised, but oddly touched. Thank you, Martha. That was thoughtful. Martha studied him with wise eyes. They're beautiful children, sir. The little girl has your mother's chin. The observation hit Victor unexpectedly. His mother's chin. He hadn't noticed, but of course Martha would. She'd worked for the Blackwell family since before his father died. I suppose she does, he said quietly. Miss Laurent is a strong woman, Martha continued. Reminds me of my daughter before the cancer took her. Same quiet dignity. Victor hadn't known Martha had lost a daughter. It struck him how little he knew about the woman who had managed his household for 15 years. Sir, if I may speak plainly, Martha asked. Victor nodded, curious. When my Robert passed, leaving me with 3 young ones to raise alone, I was terrified. But children have a way of showing you strengths you never knew you had. She paused. Those babies need both their parents, Mr. Blackwell, not just your money. Her words hit with unexpected force. Before he could respond, Dr. Reynolds approached, clipboard in hand. Mr. Blackwell, good news. All 3 babies are doing well enough to be discharged tomorrow, including little Grace. Victor nodded. And Ms. Laurent? She's recovering nicely. She can be discharged tomorrow as well. A new problem presented itself. Where would they go? The original plan had been for Elise to leave once the child. Now children were born. His home wasn't prepared for a family. But the thought of sending Elise and the triplets to some impersonal apartment while he returned to his empty mansion seemed suddenly intolerable. Thank you, Doctor, Victor said. Decision made. I'll make the necessary arrangements. Inside Elise's room, he found her sitting in a chair by the window, gazing out at the city. Motherhood had changed her already, softening some edges while strengthening others. The board wants me to send you away, he said without preamble, to hide you and the children until the media loses interest. Elise turned to him, her expression carefully neutral. And what do you want, Victor? It was a simple question with a complicated answer. What did he want? For most of his life, Victor Blackwell had pursued what he thought he wanted: success, wealth, legacy, with single-minded determination. But now, faced with this woman and the 3 tiny lives they'd created, he wasn't sure anymore. He began, then stopped. I think we should all go to my house. Together, at least until we figure out a more permanent arrangement. Something like hope flickered in Elise's eyes. Together? Yes. The word fell from his lips with surprising ease. We need to present a united front to the media anyway. It makes practical sense. Elise nodded, though her smile held a touch of sadness. Of course. Practical. The following morning brought another surprise. As Victor helped Elise into the wheelchair that would take her to the hospital entrance, a nurse entered with all 3 babies, each bundled in a soft blanket. "We thought you might want a moment with all of them before you leave," the nurse explained. Hospital policy normally wouldn't allow it, but Dr. Reynolds made an exception. Before Victor could protest, he found himself holding James, the larger of the twin boys. The weight of the infant in his arms was both terrifying and exhilarating. James gazed up at him with unfocused eyes, his tiny face scrunched in what might have been confusion or gas. "Support his head," the nurse instructed. "That's it." Victor adjusted his hold, marveling at how something so small could feel so significant. Across from him, Elise cradled Thomas in one arm and Grace in the other, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and radiance. "They're really ours," she whispered, the reality of it seeming to hit her anew. Victor looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time, not as a means to an end or a solution to a problem, but as a woman who had given him something precious beyond measure. "Yes," he said softly. "They're ours." The drive to Victor's estate was tense. He'd arranged for a convoy, his Bentley leading, followed by an SUV with specially installed car seats for the triplets and a medical nurse, and Marcus's sedan bringing up the rear. As expected, paparazzi lined the hospital exit, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. "Keep your head down," Victor instructed Elise as they approached his car. "Don't engage." She nodded, clutching her coat around her. The questions came fast and furious as they emerged. "Mr. Blackwell, did you really pay a homeless woman to have your baby? Ms. Laurent, how much did he pay you? Victor, is this a love match or strictly business?" Victor kept his arm protectively around Elise, guiding her through the gauntlet of reporters. When one particularly aggressive photographer stepped too close, Victor fixed him with a glare that could freeze fire. "My family deserves privacy," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed crowd. "Any outlet that continues to harass us will face the full force of Blackwell Industries' legal team." With that, he helped Elise into the car and closed the door firmly behind them. The word echoed in his mind. Family. He'd used it without thinking, yet it felt strangely right. Beside him, Elise exhaled shakily. "Are they always like that? Vultures?" "Yes." Victor watched the SUV with the triplets navigate through the press. "But they'll lose interest eventually. Some celebrity will get divorced or a politician will have a scandal and will be yesterday's news." "I hope you're right," Elise said, then added quietly, "I never wanted this kind of attention." Victor studied her profile. There was no guile there, no calculation. Whatever her reasons for accepting his proposition months ago, fame and notoriety clearly weren't among them. "Why did you agree?" he asked suddenly. "To have my child? You never really explained." Elise turned to look at him, her blue eyes clear and direct. "Because I was desperate. Because I was alone in a country that had stopped feeling like an opportunity and started feeling like a trap." She paused. "And because when I looked at you that day in your car, I saw someone else who was trapped, just in a different kind of cage." Her insight unsettled him. Victor had never considered himself trapped. He was the epitome of freedom, a man who could do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. And yet, wasn't there truth in her words? Hadn't he felt the walls closing in despite his wealth, his success? "We're here," he said instead of responding, as the car turned through the imposing gates of his estate. Elise gasped softly as the mansion came into view. 3 stories of limestone and glass, set on 10 manicured acres just outside the city. Fountains flanked the circular driveway, and even in winter the property exuded an air of timeless elegance. "It's beautiful," she said. "It's just a house," Victor replied automatically, though he'd spent years and millions perfecting every detail. Martha was waiting at the door, along with the rest of the household staff, all lined up to greet the new arrivals. Victor had almost forgotten his instructions to her days earlier, before the babies were born. "Everything is ready, Mr. Blackwell," Martha said warmly. "The nursery has been prepared according to your specifications." Victor blinked in surprise. "The nursery?" "Yes, sir. The East Wing, as you requested. Though we had to make some adjustments when we learned there would be 3 little ones instead of 1. Victor hadn't made any such request. He looked at Marcus, who offered a small shrug and a rare smile. "I took the liberty," his lawyer admitted. "Seemed prudent to be prepared." Inside, the house had been transformed. What had once been a showplace, elegant but sterile, now held touches of warmth. Fresh flowers brightened side tables, and in the grand foyer, a mobile of wooden stars hung from the ceiling, spinning gently in the draft. The nurse from the hospital supervised as the triplets were brought in and settled in their temporary bassinets in the formal living room. Victor watched, feeling strangely detached from the flurry of activity. This was his home, and yet suddenly it felt like a stage set, with actors playing roles he hadn't cast. Elise moved toward the babies instinctively, checking each one with gentle touches and soft words. She belonged here among them in a way Victor wasn't sure he ever could. "Sir," Martha approached quietly, "there's a call for you in your study. It's Miss Hargrove from the Times." Victor nodded and excused himself. In his study, the one room that felt unchanged, he took the call on speakerphone, while Marcus sat across from him. "Mr. Blackwell," Rachel Hargrove's crisp voice filled the room. "Thank you for taking my call. I'm working on a feature about your unique family situation. I'd like to offer you the opportunity to tell your side of the story." Victor exchanged glances with Marcus. Rachel was a respected journalist, not a tabloid hack. Having her write the story might be the best damage control they could hope for. "What exactly are you looking for, Miss Hargrove?" Victor asked carefully. "An exclusive. Inside your home, photos of you, Miss Laurent, and the babies. An interview about how this arrangement came to be." "Absolutely not," Victor said automatically. "Before you refuse," Rachel continued smoothly, "consider the alternative. Without your input, I'll be forced to rely on sources who may not have your best interests at heart." "Are you threatening me, Miss Hargrove?" Victor's voice was dangerously low. "Not at all. I'm offering you control of the narrative. One feature with me, and the rest of the press backs off. I have considerable influence with my colleagues." After she hung up, Marcus leaned forward. "She's right, you know. Better to control the story than let others define it." Victor stood and walked to the window. Outside, the winter sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow-covered grounds. In the distance, he could see the boathouse where he sometimes went to be alone, to escape the pressures of his position. "I've spent my entire life keeping my private affairs private," he said. "And now, because of one decision, everything is exposed." "Not everything," Marcus replied thoughtfully. "Just what you choose to reveal." Victor turned to his old friend. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe this is an opportunity to reshape how people see you. Not just as Victor Blackwell, ruthless businessman, but as a father. A family man." "I'm not a family man," Victor protested. "Aren't you?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You have 3 children, and their mother living in your home. By most definitions, that's a family." Before Victor could respond, a cry echoed through the house. One of the babies, his daughter from the sound of it. Something tugged at him. An unfamiliar instinct to go to her, to check that she was all right. "We're not done discussing this," he told Marcus, but he was already moving toward the door. In the living room, he found Elise attempting to comfort Grace while keeping an eye on the boys. She looked overwhelmed, despite the nurse hovering nearby. "Is everything all right?" Victor asked. Elise looked up, her exhaustion evident. "I think she's hungry. I was just about to feed her." Victor nodded awkwardly. "I'll leave you to it then." "Actually," Elise said, hesitating slightly, "could you hold James for a moment? He's getting fussy too, and I can't manage all 3 at once." Before he could formulate a reason to refuse, Victor found himself with his son in his arms for the second time that day. The baby squirmed, his tiny face reddening with the effort of working up to a proper cry. "Support his head," Elise reminded him gently. Victor adjusted his hold, feeling clumsy and out of his depth. "Like this? Yes, that's perfect." Elise smiled as she settled into a chair with grace. "You're a natural." "Hardly," Victor scoffed, but a strange warmth spread through his chest at her words. James continued to fuss, his little body tensing with discomfort. Victor stood awkwardly, unsure what to do. "Try walking with him," Elise suggested. "Sometimes movement helps." Victor began to pace slowly around the room, feeling ridiculous but determined not to fail at this simple task. To his surprise, James gradually quieted, his eyes blinking up at Victor with what seemed like curiosity. "He recognizes you," Elise said softly. "Babies know their parents' voices." "I've hardly spoken to him," Victor replied. "You spoke enough while I was carrying them. They heard you." The thought that these tiny beings had been listening to him, forming connections to him before they even existed in the world, was overwhelming. Victor looked down at James, who had fallen asleep in his arms, one tiny hand curled against his chest. "I don't know how to do this," Victor admitted, his voice barely audible. Elise looked up from feeding Grace, her expression gentle. "None of us do at first. We learn together." Together. There was that word again. It hung between them like a promise neither had made but both were somehow keeping. The moment was interrupted by Martha, who entered with a tray of tea. "Dinner will be served in an hour, Mr. Blackwell. I've taken the liberty of having it set up in the small dining room rather than the formal one. More cozy for Miss Laurent." Victor nodded. "Thank you, Martha." As she turned to go, Victor called after her. "And Martha, thank you for earlier. Your words were helpful." Martha smiled, a warm, genuine smile that transformed her usually efficient countenance. "Children have a way of changing everything, Mr. Blackwell. Usually for the better." When she left, Elise looked at Victor curiously. "You're different with her, warmer." "Martha's been with me for 15 years, Victor said. "She's reliable." "High praise from you," Elise observed with a small smile. Victor found himself smiling back, just slightly. It felt strange on his face, this expression he so rarely wore. But looking at Elise holding their daughter, with their son sleeping trustingly in his arms, and the third baby peaceful in his bassinet, something loosened in Victor's chest. For the first time in decades, Victor Blackwell allowed himself to consider a future different from the one he'd planned. One with more complications, certainly, but perhaps with more meaning as well. The journalist's offer floated back into his mind. Control the narrative. Show the world a different Victor Blackwell. Not just the ruthless businessman, but a man who could change, who could care for something beyond profit margins and stock prices. "I think," he said slowly, "we should do the interview." Elise looked up in surprise. "Are you sure? You seemed so against it earlier." "I've reconsidered." Victor looked down at James, still sleeping peacefully. "It's time the world saw the truth about us." "And what is the truth, Victor?" Elise asked quietly. It was the question at the heart of everything. The one he'd been avoiding since the moment he'd seen those 3 heartbeats on the ultrasound screen. What was the truth about them? About him? About what he truly wanted? Looking at Elise and their children, Victor Blackwell realized he didn't have all the answers anymore. And strangely, that didn't terrify him as it once would have. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted. "But I think it's time we both found out." The morning of Rachel Hargrove's interview dawned clear and cold. Victor stood at his bedroom window, watching the winter sun cast long shadows across the pristine snow, covering his estate. In just 2 hours, a journalist and photographer would be in his home, something he would have found unthinkable mere months ago. "Mr. Blackwell?" Martha's voice came from the hallway. "Miss Laurent is asking for you." "The little miss is fussing again." Victor nodded, straightening his tie before heading to the nursery. The space had been transformed in the weeks since the triplets' arrival. What had once been a rarely used guest wing now pulsed with life. Soft music playing from hidden speakers, walls painted in gentle greens and blues, and the ever-present scent of baby powder hanging in the air. Elisa sat in a rocking chair by the window, Grace cradled against her shoulder. The baby's cries had softened to whimpers, but her tiny face remained flushed with distress. "She won't settle," Elise said, exhaustion evident in her voice. "I've tried everything." Victor hesitated only a moment before reaching for his daughter. In those weeks he'd grown surprisingly comfortable with the weight of an infant in his arms. Grace blinked up at him, her tears momentarily forgotten as she recognized his face. "What's troubling you, little one?" he murmured, his voice gentler than anyone in his corporate office would have believed possible. "She knows something's happening today," Elise said, rising to check on the boys, who miraculously remained asleep in their cribs. Children sense these things. Victor paced slowly, patting Grace's back as Martha had shown him. "The photographer will be here at 10. Rachel at 10:30. Elise nodded, tucking a strand of golden hair behind her ear. "Are you sure about this, Victor? Once it's done, we can't take it back." The question hung between them. The story of their unconventional arrangement had already leaked to the press, twisted and sensationalized beyond recognition. This interview was Victor's attempt to reclaim the narrative, to define himself and this unexpected family on his own terms. "I'm sure," he said finally. "Better to face it head-on than hide and let others define us." A small smile touched Elise's lips. "You've changed, you know, have I?" Victor looked down at Grace, now settling against his chest. Or perhaps this was always there, waiting for the right catalyst. Martha appeared in the doorway, her expression apologetic. "Sir, Mr. Bennett has arrived. He's waiting in your study." Victor handed Grace back to Elise with practiced care. "I'll handle Marcus. You rest while you can." In his study, Marcus stood examining the framed photographs that now adorned Victor's desk. Images of 3 newborns, carefully posed in matching outfits. "Family portraits," Marcus observed, an uncharacteristic smile softening his usually stern features. "Never thought I'd see the day." "Neither did I," Victor admitted, gesturing for his friend to sit. "Is everything prepared for today?" Marcus nodded, opening his briefcase. "I've reviewed Ms. Hargrove's proposed questions. Nothing too invasive, but she'll want to know about the original agreement." "She can ask," Victor said, settling behind his desk. "I have nothing to hide anymore." "And the board?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Harold called me twice yesterday. They're concerned about the company image." Victor's jaw tightened. "The board will adapt or find themselves looking for new positions." "My priorities have changed, Marcus." "Yes, I've noticed." Marcus handed him a folder. "Speaking of which, I've prepared the paperwork you requested. Legal guardianship for Ms. Laurent, naming her as the children's mother with equal rights and responsibilities. I've also drafted revisions to your will, trust funds for each child, and the property transfer for the Connecticut house." Victor opened the folder, scanning the contents. "And the other matter?" Marcus reached into his breast pocket and produced a small velvet box. "As requested, though I still think you should have selected it yourself." Victor took the box, opening it to reveal a platinum ring set with a solitary diamond, elegant in its simplicity. "You have better taste than I do in these matters." "Victor," Marcus said, his tone suddenly serious, "are you certain about this?" 6 months ago, you were vehemently against emotional entanglements of any kind." Victor closed the ring box, tucking it into his desk drawer. 6 months ago I was existing, not living. I had everything and nothing simultaneously." He paused, looking out at the snow-covered grounds. "I was wrong, Marcus, about many things." The admission hung in the air between them, remarkable in its rarity. Victor Blackwell had built his reputation on being right, always right, ruthlessly right. To acknowledge error was perhaps the most telling sign of his transformation. The photographer arrived precisely at 10, a cheerful woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense efficiency that Victor appreciated. She sat up in the living room, which Martha had prepared with meticulous care. "Natural light is best for family portraits," the photographer advised, positioning a chair near the large windows. "Mr. Blackwell, if you could sit here, and Ms. Laurent with one of the babies beside you?" Victor complied, feeling strangely self-conscious. He'd been photographed countless times for business publications, but never like this, never with his guard down. his humanity exposed. "Relax your face," the photographer instructed. "Think about something that brings you joy." Victor looked at Elise, who stood holding Thomas while Martha helped arrange James in Victor's arms. Joy. It wasn't a word he'd associated with himself for decades. Yet, here it was, unexpected and undeniable. By the time Rachel Hargrove arrived, the living room had been returned to order, with the triplets napping peacefully upstairs under Martha's watchful eye. Rachel was not what Victor had expected, older than her byline photo suggested, with silver-streaked hair and shrewd eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Blackwell," she greeted him with a firm handshake. "Thank you for this opportunity. I followed your career for 20 years, but I never expected to be interviewing you about fatherhood." "Life takes unexpected turns, Miss Hargrove," Victor replied, gesturing for her to sit, "as I'm sure someone with your experience can appreciate." Rachel smiled, setting up her recorder. "Indeed. Shall we begin with how you and Miss Laurent met?" The interview flowed more easily than Victor had anticipated. He found himself speaking with unusual candor about his original motivations, the desire for a legacy without emotional complications, the carefully crafted agreement, the shock of learning about triplets. "So it was purely a business arrangement?" Rachel asked, glancing between them. "Initially, yes," Elise answered, her French accent more pronounced under pressure. "I was desperate, and Victor's offer seemed like providence. A chance to rebuild my life. And now?" Rachel probed gently. Victor exchanged a glance with Elise. "Now it's something neither of us anticipated. Something more profound. You've been described as ruthless, Mr. Blackwell. Calculating, cold. How do you reconcile that image with your new role as a father?" The question might have offended him once. Now, Victor considered it thoughtfully. Perhaps those qualities were armor, protection against vulnerability. Parenthood demands vulnerability. You cannot truly care for someone else if you're consumed with guarding yourself. Rachel nodded, making notes. "And the future? The original contract stipulated Ms. Laurent would leave after delivering the child. Will she be returning to France?" "The contract has been renegotiated," Victor said carefully. "Torn up, you mean?" Elise added with a small smile. "Yes," Victor admitted. "Some agreements become obsolete when circumstances change fundamentally. Elise will remain here, as the children's mother and—" He hesitated, not yet ready to reveal his intentions with the ring hidden in his desk drawer. "As an essential part of this family." When Rachel finally departed, promising to send a draft before publication, Victor felt strangely unburdened. For decades, he'd maintained an impenetrable public persona. The relief of setting it aside, even partially, was profound. "You did well," Elise told him as they walked upstairs to check on the triplets. "She seemed impressed by your honesty. The truth is often more disarming than the most carefully constructed narrative," Victor mused. "My father taught me that, though I chose to forget it for many years. In the nursery, they found Martha reading softly to the babies, her melodic voice lilting through a story about a bear seeking his home." She looked up as they entered, a smile warming her face. "They've been angels," she reported, rising from her chair. Even Miss Grace settled right down after her bottle. Victor approached the cribs, gazing down at his sleeping children. James slept with his tiny fists clenched, a fighter like his father. Thomas lay peacefully, one hand splayed open. And Grace, the smallest yet somehow the most commanding of the three, slept with a slight smile, as though privy to some delightful secret. "I never expected this," Victor said softly, more to himself than to Elise or Martha. "To find meaning in something so small." Martha patted his arm gently. "The smallest things often carry the greatest weight, Mr. Blackwell. My grandmother used to say that the most important things can't be measured or counted, only felt." As Martha excused herself, Victor remained transfixed by the sight of his children. "I have a board meeting tomorrow," he said to Elise. "They're expecting me to capitulate, to agree to distance myself from this situation, as Harold calls it." "And will you?" Elise asked, standing beside him. Victor shook his head. "In fact, I'm going to propose something that will likely give Harold a coronary." which is a complete reorganization. I'm stepping down as CEO to become chairman. I'll retain control of major decisions but delegate daily operations. Elise's eyes widened. Victor, are you certain? Your company has been your life. That's precisely the problem, he replied. It's been my entire life, leaving room for nothing else. These three deserve more than a father who's present only in name and bank accounts. The board meeting the following day unfolded exactly as Victor had predicted. Harold Winters went apoplectic at the proposed restructuring, his face flushing an alarming shade of crimson. This is madness, Victor. You're risking everything we've built over some midlife crisis. I prefer to think of it as a midlife clarity, Victor replied calmly. And the restructuring is happening, Harold. Whether you support it or choose to resign is entirely your decision. Diane Mercer, who had remained silent throughout the heated exchange, finally spoke. I think it's wonderful, Victor. My greatest regret is spending my children's formative years chasing partnership at the firm, while nannies witnessed their first steps and words. She smiled gently. Some wisdom comes too late to benefit our own lives, but perhaps in time to guide others. In the end, the board approved the restructuring, though Harold and two others submitted their resignations in protest. Victor found he cared far less than he would have expected. As he drove home through the gathering dusk, he felt a curious lightness, as if by relinquishing something he'd once held essential, he'd gained something infinitely more valuable. Rachel Hargrove's article appeared the following week, accompanied by the family portraits. To Victor's surprise, it was neither sensationalized nor judgmental, but rather a thoughtful examination of how unexpected circumstances can fundamentally change a person's priorities and perspective. Family Man. How Victor Blackwell Traded Corporate Conquest for Cradles. Marcus read from his tablet during breakfast. The board won't like the headline, but the content is remarkably balanced. Public reaction, Victor asked, helping Martha prepare bottles for the triplets' morning feeding. Mixed, but trending positive. Your approval rating among women over 50 has skyrocketed. Marcus smiled wryly. Apparently, the image of a powerful man, humbled by fatherhood, resonates strongly. I wouldn't call it humbled, Victor protested. Transformed, then? Elise suggested, entering with Grace in her arms. Which is accurate, I think. The days settled into a new rhythm. Board meetings and business calls balanced with feedings and diaper changes. Victor found himself noticing things he'd previously overlooked. The changing quality of light through the seasons, the subtle differences in each baby's cry, the quiet contentment on Elise's face as she sang French lullabies to their children. 3 months after the article's publication, on a crisp spring morning, Victor took Elise for a walk through the estate's gardens. The first daffodils were pushing through the soil, their yellow heads bright against the lingering patches of snow. I've been thinking, Victor said as they paused by a bench overlooking the lake. A dangerous pastime, Elise teased, her eyes crinkling with humor. Indeed. Victor reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the velvet box he'd been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment. I've been thinking about contracts and agreements, about how some bind while others liberate. Elise's expression grew serious. Victor, he withdrew the box, opening it to reveal the ring. This isn't a contract or a business arrangement. It's a request, one you're entirely free to refuse. He took a breath, finding himself uncharacteristically nervous. Elise Laurent, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because of the children or circumstances, but because I love you in a way I never thought possible. Tears welled in Elise's eyes, but her smile was radiant. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will marry you, Victor Blackwell. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Victor felt a certainty he'd never experienced in his decades of business success. This moment, this woman, their children waiting at home, was what truly mattered. Their wedding was a small affair, held in the garden as summer reached its peak. Only close friends attended. Marcus as best man, Martha beaming with pride, and Dr. Reynolds, who had delivered the triplets and become something of a family friend. The babies, now 6 months old, were present in matching outfits, watched over by a pair of nurses. During the reception, Victor found himself standing apart, watching as Elise laughed with Martha near the rose garden. The sunlight caught her hair, turning it to spun gold. "She's remarkable," Marcus observed, joining him with glasses of champagne. "You're a fortunate man, Victor." "Yes," Victor agreed, accepting the drink, though fortune had little to do with it, didn't it? Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What would you call that chance encounter at a traffic light?" Victor considered this. Perhaps not chance at all. Perhaps destiny. Marcus nearly choked on his champagne. "Good God, you really have changed." "Next you'll be writing poetry." Victor laughed, a genuine sound that still surprised those who knew him from his corporate days. "No poetry, but I have gained some perspective." That perspective deepened as the years passed. Victor's restructured role at Blackwell Industries allowed him to be present for milestones large and small. First words, first steps, first days of school. He still commanded respect in the business world, but it was no longer the sole measure of his worth. On the triplets' 5th birthday, the family gathered in the garden for a celebration. Friends and school classmates ran among the trees, their laughter carrying on the summer breeze. Victor stood watching as James, Thomas, and Grace Sophia blew out the candles on their cake, Elise beside them capturing the moment on camera. Later, as twilight settled over the estate, Victor sat on the terrace with Elise, their hands intertwined as they watched the children's last bursts of energy before bedtime. "Do you ever regret it?" Elise asked quietly. "The change in your life?" "The company?" Victor shook his head. "Not for a moment. The company was never going to visit me in retirement or hold my hand when I'm old." He squeezed her fingers gently. "I spent decades accumulating wealth and power, believing they were the measures of a successful life. I wrong. What is the measure then?" Elise asked. Victor watched as Grace ran to help a smaller child who had fallen, her natural compassion evident even at 5. James and Thomas followed, offering their toys in consolation. "Love," he said simply. "Not the grand dramatic kind from films, but the everyday kind that shows itself in small moments. The kind that makes you put someone else before yourself, not because you must, but because you want to. The kind that grows stronger rather than fading with time." He looked at Elise, the woman who had once been a desperate stranger in his car, now the center of his world. "We think we're building legacies through our work, our achievements, our wealth. But the true legacy is in the love we give and receive, in the hearts we touch, in the lives we help shape." Elise leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "For a man who once claimed emotions were inefficient, you've become quite the philosopher." Victor smiled, watching as Martha emerged from the house to call the children for bedtime stories. "Not philosophy, just belated wisdom." The children ran to them for goodnight kisses, their faces sticky with cake and excitement. As Victor embraced each one, he marveled at how completely they had changed him, how what had begun as a coldly practical arrangement to secure a legacy had instead transformed the legacy itself. His worth was no longer measured in dollars and acquisitions, but in bedtime stories and morning smiles, in Grace's drawings proudly displayed in his office, in the twins' enthusiastic reports of school adventures, in Elise's warm presence beside him. Each night, life's greatest treasures, Victor had learned, rarely come through contracts and calculations. They arrive unexpectedly, often disguised as complications or disruptions to our carefully laid plans. The true measure of wisdom is recognizing them for what they are, not inconveniences, but invitations to a richer, more meaningful existence than we could have designed for ourselves. And sometimes, the most profound journey isn't from poverty to wealth, but from isolation to connection, from a life that looks impressive from the outside, but feels hollow within, to one overflowing with the messy, unpredictable, irreplaceable joy of loving and being loved in return. Thank you for joining us on this journey of love and transformation. Did Victor's story touch your heart? Let us know in the comments below what you think about his choice to put family before fortune. Don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming stories that remind us what truly matters in life.